Disclosures for traditional finance are not necessarily the same disclosures that would be material or important for digital assets.
If the Patrick McHenry Ag Financial Services bill were to pass the Senate, which we think it could probably pass the House, but the Senate is another thing entirely, and were the president to actually sign it and not veto it, how does that affect these lawsuits moving forward, or does it affect it at all?
It will not.
Okay.
It doesn't have a retroactivity aspect.
I haven't looked to see whether it would have retroactive application, but in general, what this proposed legislation would do is create a path for registration for digital assets firms and an exemption from the definition of securities under certain circumstances. In general, that if the digital asset is sufficiently decentralized over the previous 12 months, then it could qualify under an exemption. And then for certain types of preliminary registration, there's protection so that you can't be prosecuted for the sale of unregistered securities if you are complying with the application requirements. And so that
So it doesn't make it a commodity; it just makes it
Not a security.
a security that is, what's the word? Not subject to traditional securities filings.
Well, and to be clear, one outcome of the new proposed regulatory framework would be digital assets that are qualified as commodities and would have to comply.
But you could have three categories, right? You could have commodity, a security that's exempt under this new category, and then a straight up traditional security.
Correct. And so to be slightly more clear, what the proposed legislation does is it requires the SEC and the CFTC to cooperate and exercise some degree of joint jurisdiction over treatment of digital assets. And so we're not talking about creating a new department. We're not currently talking about what's called an SRO, or self-regulating organization. We're talking about a mandate from Congress that the SEC and CFTC collaborate on rulemaking along the lines of what's proposed in that legislation. And that would involve carving out certain securities jurisdiction and then creating a pathway for compliance both with the securities laws and with the commodities laws. There's one other thing I wanted to pick up on, which was very important in all of this, and that has to do, and now of course it slipped my mind, but it'll come back, and it was a brilliant thought, I promise.
I'm sure it was brilliant.
Just interrupt me whenever that comes back, because we want to make sure to be the ones that break the news on this on this thought. Okay, so I'm grasping what this, and it makes sense that it would not be retroactive because there are things that you have to do in order to qualify for this, which obviously a lot of these other assets did not do and could not have done. But maybe if the legislation passes, it makes a judge a little bit more amenable to a favorable outcome because he knows, or he or she knows in the future, that's what that's what their intention is, the legislature's intention is.
That reminded me of what the thing is.
Oh,
so the exemption from prosecution for securities laws violations is specific to registration, not to fraud. Okay.
Oh, sure.
So nothing prevents the SEC from prosecuting securities fraud cases against digital assets that they deem to be securities, which is an important thing to flag. But to your point, I think this goes to one of the fundamental questions here is, what is the purpose of securities laws and commodities laws? And generally speaking, it's to make sure that investors who purchase securities have received full and fair disclosures so that they're able to make informed choices about what they're buying and selling. And so, the issue is, as has been flagged in these congressional hearings, disclosures for traditional finance are not necessarily the same disclosures that would be material or important for digital assets. So-called tokenomics, the governance structures, things like that, the way the smart contracts work, are not things that are necessarily contemplated in a traditional finance filing. And so, one thing to think about, and one thing that we work with our clients on, is if you read the writing on the wall and you say, some form of legislation like this is likely to pass, What can we do now to start getting our ducks in a row, start making these disclosures, start building a platform that can comply with what we anticipate the future regulation is likely to be? How strong of a defense will that give you in current litigation? That is a big question mark, because you're still going to be held to the standards of current existing law, but it's going to be a relevant consideration when you may be faced with allegations of not making full and adequate disclosures. And you can say, well, we've done the best we can under the current framework and anticipating what we think the requirements should be for digital assets. And that's going to be one of the things that we're facing.
Hey, it's Amy. Click over here to subscribe, click over here for more content, and we'll see you next time.